Hi, I'm Maggie Peralta-Lee, a senior paralegal at KCERA. Welcome back to our 6-part member education series following fictional members Kelly and Pat through their careers with KCERA. In part 1, we looked at enrollment and how our staff makes sure each new member is placed in the correct tier with the right contribution rate and verified documentation. In this episode, we'll follow Pat as he goes through a divorce, and we'll show you how that life event can affect a KCERA pension, what community property means for both member and former spouse, and how our legal, member services, and finance teams work together to keep member benefits on track.
Last month, we began a 6-part educational series where we introduced you to Kelly and Pat, our 2 hypothetical members with very real life events. Now today we'll be continuing that journey as we walk you through part 2, which will explore how a divorce impacts a member and their former spouse as it relates to the member's pension and the intricate procedures the staff at KCERA face when they're processing that divorce. Now, before we delve into that, let's take a moment to refresh ourselves on the high points of what we discussed last month in the first part of the series, which was enrollments. So as you may remember, Kelly represents our general membership. She is unmarried, has no children, and she is now working as a full-time nurse at our local county hospital. Now, Pat, on the other hand, represents our safety membership. He's married, and if you remember, he attended and graduated the academy and is now working as a full-time deputy at the Sheriff's Department. Last month, our Chief Financial Officer, Angela Kruger, walked you through our enrollment process as she reviewed the rigorous steps that KCERA staff take to ensure that each new member has been placed in the correct tier, the correct contribution rate has been set, all the data has been verified, and the required documents have been received, such as that sworn statement card that we had talked about. So now let's fast forward to today and the presentation that we have in store for you. So you're primarily going to hear from our legal team as they'll guide you through the process our staff follows when we have a member who's going through or has been through a divorce during their career. Now you may be asking yourself, what does a divorce have to do with someone's KCERA pension? Well, the pension with KCERA is an asset and therefore it's subject to community property. So this basically means that when a member has been divorced during their career with a KCERA plan sponsor, their former spouse may be entitled to their percentage of their pension. So as you can imagine, these situations can be quite sensitive and emotional. You've probably already figured out our married member, Pat, is now divorced. It was discovered by staff when Pat submitted a beneficiary change form to update his beneficiary to his new spouse. Now, this wasn't discovered because Pat contacted us prior to or during the divorce proceedings, or because he provided us a complete copy of his divorce documents. No, in this instance, it was discovered because of the methodical processes KCERA has in place and the diligence of the KCERA staff. So as with many of the processes and challenges that KCERA staff encounter, divorces aren't that different when it comes to the overlapping or involvement of other divisions. So now I've said this before, and I'm sure I will say it again and again, but collaboration and teamwork are essential. And this truly is one of the areas where KCERA staff exhibit their many strengths. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our Chief Legal Officer, Jennifer Zari.
Thank you, Sherry, and good afternoon, members of the board. As Sherry mentioned, we are going through the Divorce and Marriage series. I have brought with me also Maggie Peralta-Lee, our senior paralegal. She, along with our senior legal secretary, Irma, handle the lion's share of these matters and elevate matters to the attorneys when necessary. So I brought her along to jump in if I misstate something. So that's where the voice is coming from in the back. Also, I'd point out that as we went through the process with our Chief Financial Officer, that's a very linear process. This process is not linear. Everything comes from all directions, so I will try to make it as organized as I can, but keeping in mind that this is really not as linear as we would like it to be. So we're picking up with Pat. So Pat was onboarded in our prior series, and now he's been with KCERA. He's been with his employer for about 6 years. He has 6 years of service, and he calls up KCERA to inform our staff that he is now going through a divorce, and he wants to know how that might affect his pension. Financially, how that might affect his pension. He's still an active member, not looking to retire. Obviously, he's only had 6 years in at this point. And so however that comes in, if that gets fielded to front desk or member services, all calls related to divorce get forwarded to the legal team for a legal consultation. And the legal team will speak with Pat, talk to him about what his current circumstances are. Sometimes members are at a place where they just want initial information, so we'll hear his story, review his circumstances, and see if it's appropriate for him to receive one of the services that KCERA provides, which we call a DRO estimate letter, a domestic relations order estimate letter, in which staff can gather information from him and send him out a letter that tells him an estimate of what his former spouse's community property share of his pension might be. So if he is a vested member and he's preparing or trying to get his documents in order for his divorce process, that's something that's available to him. Our staff would send him a form to complete, and when he returns that form to us, legal turns it over to our member services team, and they provide the information that will supply the calculations and the number for the member. Now, keep in mind, you will hear later on in the process what happens when a member retires and in the audit process. But even at this DRO estimate letter process, Member Services informs that they do a complete audit of his entire file to make sure that we are providing the best possible estimate for him so that he knows the potential community property interests that he and his former spouse have. So once Member Services goes through that very difficult calculation, they provide that member that information back to the legal services, to the legal team, and then the legal team drafts that into a letter that gets sent to the member. So he has a nice letter that shows the actual calculations, the formula and the calculations that he can use in his divorce proceedings. It also describes the limitations of the letter. Obviously, the letter is it's designed to address the most common divisions, which is under what we call the time rule, which is basically time worked during marriage over total time worked. That's essentially the calculation times 50%. And so letting the member know that that's not always how community property is divided, but that is the most common way. And obviously, when Member Services calculates this, they do this to show what it would be if he'd retired at his earliest possible retirement date. If he retired at a different date, deferred and left, obviously the calculation changes a bit. But so after a conversation with Pat, this letter might benefit him and he's interested in receiving the letter. So staff goes through all these processes to deliver the letter to him. So now that he has the letter, usually in the initial conversation, staff also has the conversation with him to say, when you go through the divorce process, when you get your order, please send us a draft so that we can make sure everything's in order before you file it with the court, just to prevent any future delays. Sometimes members hear that, and oftentimes they don't. So with Pat, we sent him the letter, we provided all that advice up front, and we didn't hear from him for another 4 years. So now he's at 10 years of service, and it's been really all quiet from Pat until, as Sherry mentioned, staff receives in the mail or dropped off at the front desk, receives a change of beneficiary form. When that form comes across a member services desk to review, they don't just, a new beneficiary form, let's plug in the new beneficiary. No, they have to review the file to see if our member is even able to change their beneficiary, because there could be a court order in place that prevents them from changing their beneficiary. So Member Services will review the change of beneficiary forms as they come in. They notice that the name on the form is a different name than the prior beneficiary form, and the marriage certificate we have on file corresponds to the prior beneficiary form. So we're assuming this is a new spouse, but we don't have any divorce orders or any document showing that he has been divorced from his prior spouse. So that will prompt member services team to again work in coordination with each other and refer that matter to legal to follow up. So when the legal team follows up with the member, they will explain that we have received your change of beneficiary form, but we can't implement it at this time because we need documentation showing that you're actually divorced from your prior spouse. So in this situation, we became aware of his divorce through this change of beneficiary forms. Oftentimes, this doesn't come in, this comes in many different ways. We can get judgments in the mail, judgments via email, a letter from an attorney, a letter from a former spouse, sometimes just a letter saying, I have an interest in this person's pension. So the information or how we learn about divorces comes from all different directions, and it's staff working together and paying attention to things. It's staff talking to members and having to mention things that we learn about these, and we're able to address these matters hopefully before the member comes for retirement. So even though Pat received that initial counseling when he was asking for his DRO estimate letter, sometimes members don't remember, they forget, and now when he's in having this conversation with the legal team, he says, well, why do you even need my judgment anyways? I'm telling you that I'm divorced. Why do you even need this? And staff will explain that we need these for several reasons. There's several educational items that have to be provided when we talk to the members, just so to make them aware of this very complicated process. Informing them about what community property is and why your pension can be community property. How it's divided by the court matters. It has to be consistent with the laws that apply to KCERA, and how the court orders us to distribute it also has to comply with the laws of KCCERA. So there's a lot of education that's done about community property and what it is. Service performed during marriage is an asset of the community. Oftentimes we receive a lot of silent judgments where couples don't even address it at all because they don't realize it's an asset, or they never thought to do it. Also, from the plan perspective, the family code, the statutes require, they say if the plan is aware that a former spouse has a community property interest in a member's pension, we are put on notice of that, then we can be held liable for not protecting that former spouse's interest. So there's a fiduciary component owed to the former spouse or the soon-to-be former spouse as well that KCCERA is very mindful of. When Pat is on the phone with our legal team being explained and counseled on this process, he asked about his service purchase. Well, I was involved in the military. I have military time that I have not yet purchased, that I performed before I was married, and now I've got this divorce. Is that going to mess things up? Is that going to change anything about the judgment I already got? And staff can explain that there is case law on point that says that the court looks at the status, your marital status at the time you perform the service. So in Pat's case, if he was not married at the time he performed the military service, then that is separate property. That is his separate property. And also in his case, he hasn't purchased it yet, so it would not have been purchased with community funds. So luckily for him, he does not have an issue in terms of his prior military service and wanting to purchase it later. That will be his separate property. Obviously, if things change, if he would have been married at the time that he performed that military service, that would be community property, considered community property. And or if he made the purchase while he was married. Even if he performed it outside of marriage, if he made the purchase while he was married, the cost of the purchase, 50% of that, would also be community property. So lots of things to consider. But in Pat's case, he does not have to worry. His divorce order he has, we don't know yet what his divorce order looks like because he hasn't given it to us, but he's not going to have to worry about the service purchase part of it. That will remain his separate property. Another counseling point that legal staff also has to do when they talk to members about this is also counsel on what the KCCERA plan is and isn't. Many members and many many minutes, hours of staff time goes into explaining that KCERA is not a 401k plan. We see lots of orders where members think that the contributions they pay is the extent of their benefit. I paid in $50,000 of contributions, we're just going to split that, and the order comes in saying we're splitting the $50,000, and then we have to explain that is not your entire benefit. That is one small portion of it. That does not cover, this order does not cover your entire benefit. We need you to go back and correct your judgment to include the whole benefit, because we don't know how to distribute it when you haven't addressed your entire benefit. So that's a lot of education that staff does. Also, confusion with the VOYA plan, confusion with our name. So I know we're making a lot of inroads on, and Sherry will speak to that, on what we're doing on the communication side with members, but it is a source of confusion regularly about misnaming or misunderstanding our plan. One thing to remember about the KCERA plan, and that's based on what the Board of Supervisors has not elected to do, is that our plan requires, when members get their divorce judgments and the property has been divided by a court order, active members, no money is paid out to a former spouse until our member retires. So if the member could go as long as they want, and until that member retires, the former spouse will not receive any funds, and that can be a source of, I guess, financial difficulty for the former spouse, and that's usually when we would see some kind of support order in lieu. And I think on this slide. On the next slide, I will speak to something that might address that issue. So continuing our counseling and what we have to walk through with the member and helping them understand why we need their documents and why we need them to go through all these steps so that we can make sure their documents are in order when they're ready to retire. We also have to make sure that the order complies with the SURL. The court does not have jurisdiction to order our plan to do something or provide a benefit that is not currently offered by our plan, so we have to check those. Oftentimes we will try to explain that to the member and try to work it out so that we can find a way to still clear them without violating our plan. Oftentimes, if the member's not responsive at all, we do have to go to court and set aside that order, show the court that order is not valid. We cannot honor that order because it violates our plan documents. Methods of distribution, we haven't received one in a while, but we used to receive orders that would say, KCERA, you are ordered to split the plan, and 25% of this goes to the member, and you are ordered to start paying them on this date. And we have to say, KCERA's the Board of Supervisors of Kern County has not adopted the optional section that requires separate accounts. There is a section in the SURL about separate accounts that does just that, where the parties agree to a certain percentage of contributions or a certain percentage of time service credit, and then they create two separate accounts so that the former spouse, when they receive, if the member is vested, if the former spouse achieves the age of eligibility to retire, they can start drawing that money, and it doesn't affect the member because the member has their own account. And also, under a system that has a separate account, the former spouse could just withdraw all of the money if they wanted to. So they don't have these issues with the lockup, I guess a lockup of time. And you'll see as we go through, as I explain the option 4. Options 2 through 4. So sometimes the court, when we see a court order, the court might require the member to list their former spouse on an option, which would provide the former spouse with a lifetime benefit when the member passes. But keep in mind, and I think we've addressed this before, those options are irrevocable. So once listed, that cannot be changed. So if later in time the couple says, or the former spouse says, no, I don't need that money anymore, you have a new spouse, go ahead and provide for them, we can't do it because the statute says it's irrevocable. So systems that have separate accounts, we've heard that they don't really have, their members don't elect the options as much because these former spouses have a separate account that they can draw on right away. And so we don't have these issues sometimes with people members being required to list a spouse and then not being able to provide for a future spouse a continuance. So when we're talking to Pat about his documents and explaining how, we haven't seen your divorce, we need to make sure that that's all in order before we can update your beneficiary, we will talk to him about sending in a joinder. A joinder is the document that gives the court jurisdiction that brings KCERA into the case and now gives the court jurisdiction over KCERA to require us to distribute in accordance with the order, obviously as long as it's compliant with our plan. We'll ask him for his judgment or legal separation. We'll need the domestic relations order. Sometimes people get a divorce and it says pension will be divided pursuant to a domestic relations or pursuant to time rule. And then they never go get the DRO, the domestic relations order. They just don't prepare it. They just, okay, we're divorced, and they just leave it there for a later time. So if members that don't have the DRO prepared, who are already divorced, we have a template on our website. It's fillable. It has exactly what's supposed to be listed there. Again, it's under the time rule. That doesn't have to be the division, but that is a good service, an easy service that the member can use. And even if the member has an attorney, the attorneys can use those forms for free. And those get processed much quicker because I've already reviewed them. We've signed off on the language. Legal staff can process those quickly. Not to discourage anybody from using an attorney, but when the attorneys prepare them, we see a lot of different legal language that then has to be reviewed by an attorney. So that process is a little bit slower than using our template. Sometimes one of the other options that would allow a former spouse to receive money earlier is called a Gilmore election. We don't see this very often, but it's a situation where the parties can agree that the former spouse we're going to treat the member as if they had retired at the time of the divorce, whatever that service credit looks like. And from in between the time that the member keeps working and then the member actually retires, the member will pay the spouse out of pocket, just themselves. KCERA will not do the payment. And then when the member actually does go to retire, then KCERA will start paying the former spouse, but based on an earlier retirement age, not their actual retirement date. It will be the time that they actually entered into the Gilmore election or the DRO. So that is one way, but really that's the only way we have right now for former spouses to get paid prior to a member's retirement, because we have not elected the separate accounts options. So in reviewing Pat's domestic relations order, we see that provides for a time rule, and the non-member spouse is designated as his option for beneficiary. So lucky for Pat, even though he didn't, we would prefer that he had submitted the documents for us to review so that if there was anything wrong with them, we could have brought those changes to his attention, and he could have made those changes before it went to court. Lucky for him that everything was in order. We advise him, staff would advise him that this option 4 means that when you go to retire, your former spouse will have to be listed here, and whatever that time rule percentage was, that's how much that spouse, your former spouse, is going to receive for the rest of their life after you die. And your new spouse that you have, you can put her on there and she can receive the remainder of the percentage. But that's what the option 4 means. Sometimes we find that when we explain that to members, they didn't realize that that's what they were signing off on their DRO. They didn't realize that was part of their DRO. And so that sometimes they want to go back to court and fix that because they didn't even realize that that's what their court order had obligated them to do. This whole process, Pat is an active member, so he's only has 10 years in, so he has time to get all of his documents in order, and then what we say, we clear him on the legal side so that when he is ready to retire, member services can just handle the retirement documents for him and get him on payroll. However, if he had been pending retirement, say we're doing all this at the 20-year mark and he's ready to retire, and we find that the DRO isn't in accordance with the SERL, now he's got to wait for it to go back to court, and so the date that his date of retirement won't be affected, but the date he goes on payroll will be affected. And so sometimes members are waiting 2, 3, 4 months because they're doing something in court, and that takes a long time. So we try to get the message to members that this is very difficult. You want to make sure your divorce, if you've gone through a divorce, make sure all those documents are in good order, have been reviewed by KCERA before you get time, before you're coming close to retirement. Otherwise, you might not be receiving that pay check on the date that you anticipated, and that could cause a financial hardship as well. For our retired members, if Pat had been retired, and then he was going through a divorce, once we receive a notice, say his former spouse sent us a letter that said, I have an interest in this pension, so now she's put us on notice, and now we're liable if we don't protect that pension. So we do, we inform the member that we withhold a certain amount from his retirement check every month until that DRO is finalized. And once that DRO is finalized, our finance team will true up that amount and then get the right amounts to the member and to the former spouse. But again, that could be a financial hardship for our member who's living on a reduced pension payment while this divorce is processing. So we recognize that, and the big picture, big message is we want to get these divorce documents finalized as soon as possible so that no one on either side is having to suffer a financial hardship because of this.
If I may jump in, also a few years ago when we were starting to apply a lot of this process and being a little more strict in reviewing the divorce documents that we were receiving, the courts noticed, our local Kern County Superior Court noticed that there was an influx of people having to go back to court to fix court orders because KCERA couldn't abide by them. They weren't CERL compliant. So the local court actually implemented a new local court rule. It is now Local Court Rule 6.1.4, which requires a plan administrator to sign off on a DRO before the court signs off on it and it becomes a lawful order. That's kind of an extra step for us to make sure that we review that language before it even gets filed, and for the member to make sure that we're checking and we're getting everything we need to look at before anything could move forward from there.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. It's really important, and that is the preferred method, is if the member gave us their pending DRO or pending divorce judgment, the draft, so that we could look at it, and then we write them a letter that says this, KCERA doesn't have any objections, or this is compliant with our documents, and they can provide that to the court so that the court can proceed with their orders, and that doesn't get held up at that stage either. So as we said, Pat was lucky. His judgment was fine. His DRO was fine. He understands that now he has this option 4 that's going to happen when he retires, and he's going to have to name his former spouse. But these are other issues that could and do happen on a regular basis. Thankfully, not to Pat. Sometimes we get very old judgments that people just bring in again right before retirement. They'll bring in a judgment. There's something wrong with it, and then we need them to correct it before we can hear them so they can be put on payroll. Sometimes, again, wrong names, wrong name of plan, wrong name of KCERA. Sometimes there's invalid provisions within the judgment that say, you need to pay out $20,000 immediately, KCCERA, to the former spouse, and we can't do that. Sometimes the judgment doesn't say the same thing as the DRO, and now we have conflicting orders that we need them to reconcile. Sometimes they don't address anything, and there is an overlap of community property to a large extent. And we need them to address that. On the legal separation issues, we don't see those as much, but they are there. And when members have legal separation, it's a little bit different, where the courts have said, California courts have said that legally separated spouse can still be treated as a surviving spouse. So the member could take an unmodified option and still have that legally separated spouse named as a spouse, and at the member's passing, if they were still only legally separated, that spouse can continue to receive that benefit for the remainder of their life. However, if they were to get divorced at any point after that, and the legally separated spouse was still there, that they would not get a continuance. So some people don't follow up, they don't change their beneficiaries, and sometimes these things happen where the member should have or could have named somebody else. And especially if they were remarried, that person could have gotten a continuance. These are some other overlapping, non-standard issues that do occur. Sometimes we come across overlapping marriages. They have a new spouse and a new change of beneficiary. Thankfully, this wasn't Pat, where we realized there's a new spouse named, but yet there's not a divorce from the old spouse. or receive a divorce, but it's a divorce in Mexico and that's not valid in California if you're a resident of California. So we have seen things like that, and it gets a little messy, but it does occur. We have members who have been ordered to select a certain option that's been more in the past, and they didn't, or we didn't have the order. We've had people who have been married and reconciled, divorced and reconciled and divorced and reconciled multiple times. We have to address those situations. And so we're trying to make sure that we're creating a good paper trail to protect everybody's interests, including KCERA's and both the member and former spouse. Out-of-state divorces, with people moving out of state, the divorce could happen out of state, and when they have out-of-state judgments, those have to be, what is the word? Domesticated, thank you, in the California court, so that we can have jurisdiction to distribute according to the court order. And that can be, we have a very good explanation letter that tells them how to do it, but it's definitely easier when they engage the services of an attorney to help them do that. All this correspondence is verbal, sometimes it's in person, sometimes it's via email and letters. Staff is corresponding regularly with the member, the non-member spouse, any divorce attorneys that may call us, the LDAs that may be assisting in their DRO preparation. If, for example, we did get a draft and it didn't conform, it had several issues with it, we draft letters explaining in detail what's wrong with the DRO and how they need to fix it. And then to the extent that we don't hear from the member, sometimes we have to initiate hearings in court to go set aside these orders. So all of that I have described is largely handled by the legal team. However, as Sherry mentioned, we do not do this alone. We work collaboratively with all of our units within KCERA. So the finance team has a part in this process. Also, when there are spousal support orders, finance team administers those and make sure they don't exceed the 50% net income. Sometimes we have a DRO that requires a certain percentage go to the former spouse, and we also and we have to make sure that we have a spousal support order so that we don't exceed 50%.
Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the board. I am Maritza Rodriguez, and I am filling in for Angela, who is not in the office today. Our finance team, we process spousal support orders received from the courts, and all orders are reviewed by legal before they come to our department. We also process child support withholding orders. Currently, we have 4 child support orders and 5 spousal support orders that were processed. We review spousal support orders and child support orders to make sure that there are not more than the threshold of 50% of the member's net income. We adjust the payments if it's necessary. We review the deductions annually to verify we are withholding no more than the 50%. When we have pending quadros, usually benefit staff will go into our CPAS program, our pension system, and it will reduce the payment to 50%, and Sherry will talk about it more later in the presentation. We review the deductions annually to verify that we are withholding the required amounts. We also go into CPAS and we adjust the payments if it's necessary. Finance also tracks and accounts for deductions. We reconcile balances when the final payouts are made to make sure any funds withheld in the excess of the LPE payout are returned to the member. We also review the tax withholding to make sure that taxes are properly taken. Our team also runs a sample batch to make sure that the 1099s are accounting the numbers correctly and the amounts are deducted correctly before we email out the 1099s.
All right, thank you. So member services, as you know, Jennifer and Maritza both alluded to, we work very closely together, collaborating when it comes to a divorce. As Jennifer stated, the legal team does all the counseling for the members when they're calling in for a divorce. Member services counsels on everything else retirement related, but when we do have a divorce, situation arise, our legal team handles all of that counseling. As she stated, once through those communications with whether it be the member, the former spouse, the attorney, and there's a decision that there needs to be a quadro estimate completed, they send that intake form over to my staff and we will process that calculation. Now, as Jennifer stated, when we get that request, we're not just going to use the information on that intake form. We are going to review that member's file. We're going to audit it just like we would a new retiree file. We're going to go from their hire date all the way to the current date in time, and we're going to look, verify that information and that data in their record is accurate, because we want to provide the most accurate information as possible when that's relayed to the member for them to take to court. Once we complete that, we send that over to the legal team, and then they go from there. For beneficiary updates, one of the other ways that we find out, like with Pat, that there's a divorce is through beneficiary updates. Now, the member services team does all the counseling and processing of those beneficiary updates, and this is where those methodical processes come into play. Is when we receive those beneficiary updates, my staff's not just going to go in and update it, they're going to review that member's beneficiary history, because we want to make sure that they're not going from a spouse to a non-spouse or a spouse to a new spouse without us having the proper documentation. So that's going to red flag it. The staff is going to make a phone call to the member, and they're going to ask the question, is this beneficiary change due to a death or is it due to a divorce? Sensitive questions, but it has to be asked because we need to make sure that we are helping take care of this member in the best way possible. If it's a death, we're going to request a copy of the death certificate, and then we'll be able to process that beneficiary update. If it's for a divorce, then we're going to request those divorce documents, send that over to the legal team, and we're going to notify our legal team of the situation. We'll make notes in that member's CPAS record to memorialize it. That will also assist the legal team further down the road during the work that they're putting in on that divorce case. We will also, if that beneficiary update came in as part of the retirement packet. So when a member submits their retirement application packet, inside is a beneficiary form. When we're auditing that file for retirement from that 20, 30, however many years of data that we're reviewing, if we find any divorces in there, or if we notice a change in beneficiary on that beneficiary form, we're once again going to be notifying legal to work on that case, get those divorce documents. We will notify the member when we get that application packet that we notice you have changed your beneficiary, or you've had a divorce that we never received the divorce documents for one reason or another. We don't have those divorce documents. And we will advise them, and we even put it in writing, that we cannot place them on payroll until we have those completed divorce documents and the legal team has reviewed them and approved them. So they know ahead of time. Now, we also, if we have, on the retirement process, I'll go over more detail on the retirement process in another training session that we'll have. In I think a couple of months with you guys. I'll go into more detail on that. One of the other processes is that where we see divorces come up is on a death, when we have a member that passes away, or even an alt payee that passes away. And through that process, if it's an active member that passes away, then we're going to audit that file, but we're going to have to make sure that we're reviewing what option the member chose at retirement if it's a death of a retiree, so that we can make sure that we're paying out the proper benefit to the correct beneficiary. If there's an alternate payee, then we need to make sure if that member's passed away, that alternate pay, if there's a survivor, that member's benefit's going to continue, so then that alternate payee will continue to get their benefit. If the alternate payee passes away, then we have to make sure that beneficiary, they have a beneficiary named so that they can continue to get their community property. This is processes that we work really closely with legal. We need to make sure that we have these divorce documents sooner rather than later, and that's one of the reasons why we do so much. We stress on it so much when we do outreach. I am very happy to say we have really ramped up our outreach over the past year. And in the outreach we have, I'm going to kind of skip around on my PowerPoint here, but in the outreach, we provide kiosk when we do presentations to plan sponsors, to the departments. Jeremy Rowell, our communications manager, has developed this wonderful display kiosk, and it's got a lot of our brochures that talk about different parts of retirement, whether it be the retirement roadmap or purchase as a service or divorce. And so we are able to take that kiosk and we leave it there with those departments so they can put it in their common area. And that way the employees have that access at their fingertips while they're taking a break or walking by, whatever the case may be. So that's one way for us to get this information out and be as proactive as possible. One of the other ways is obviously our counseling sessions, our one-on-one with the member, whether it be Zoom, phone call, face-to-face. One of the very first questions the team will ask these members is, have you had a divorce during your career? Because even if we haven't even looked at their beneficiary information yet, we're counseling them, that's gonna be one of the first questions we ask, because we wanna make sure that we are getting that information and stressing the importance of how that divorce can impact their pension. We also, at the new employee orientations, we attend those every month. In the presentation, we have slides talking about divorce. And we know early on, right as they first started, it may not be an issue, but it could be something that they encounter through their career. They may end up, becoming divorced or separated. That could turn into a divorce, or they could even just have a coworker that is going through a divorce. But we've instilled those little nuggets of information talking about divorce and how important it is for them to contact KCERA. So we want to leave those little nuggets, and that way they can point their coworkers in the right direction, or they themselves come talk to us sooner rather than later, so that our legal team has time to review that and it's not holding up any payouts or them going on pension, the payroll. We also are being invited and showing up to the county's career expos. DHS is having Job Fest, and a lot of our plan sponsors and departments are doing health fairs, and we're being invited. We recently did the REOKC Health Fair, and we're taking all of this information there. We're talking to these members, these potential members, about KCERA, and a lot of the questions that do come up for our members that are there is divorce, purchase as a service, divorce. Those are questions that do arise. And a wonderful tool that we have is our website. Jeremy has done a fantastic job giving our website a facelift and is keeping that current and up to date. And we have good detailed information out on our website that we can direct our members to as well if they want this information digital. One of the things Jennifer did mention was that we cannot place a member on payroll if we don't have those divorce documents. We also cannot pay out any refunds. So if the member is terminated or resigned, they're wanting to withdraw their funds, we cannot pay those out either until we have those divorce documents cleared. So every angle, every opportunity that we have, we try to stress to the members the importance of getting those divorce documents submitted sooner rather than later. As for the 50% hold or the for retirees, when Jennifer's team, the legal team, when they contact member services on, we have a retiree where we've got a notice of adverse interest, the member services team will process those calculations, and then once the divorce is final, we will then go back in, make the adjustments, process those calculations to do any refunds or any retroactive pays, put the alt payee on payroll, and then we work very closely with the finance team. So every aspect of that divorce calculation, we're working very closely with both finance and legal. So that concludes my portion. I'm going to hand it back over to Jennifer.
So we're just recapping, and then if there are any questions. So just to prepare you for our next episode in this series, as we leave Pat is now divorced, but also now remarried. So And the only reason we knew is because he wanted to change his beneficiary to his new spouse. And so his new spouse will be his primary beneficiary. We did receive all his documents. We have his judgment, we have the joinder, we have the judgment, we have the DRO. It will be split pursuant to time rule, or whatever that percentage is, to his former spouse, and then at retirement. Luckily, he can also purchase his military service, and we'll have an episode on that, because and they didn't address anything different in the DRO. And so now he is cleared by legal. When he is ready to retire, we can hand him off to member services, and there won't be anything for him to do. So good on him, and we hope more members follow that path, but also with the caveat that getting us to a draft before and not letting us find out this way would be better. So he's still an active member. He's only 10 years in, so at this point, he will just continue to receive his regular pay. There will be nothing deducted given to his former spouse until he's ready to retire.
That concludes this episode of KCERA's Life Cycle of a Member video series. Make sure to catch the next episode linked below. On behalf of KCERA, thanks for watching.